Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Hulter. I am an active duty Air Force technical sergeant and founder of the organization called Agitare. It is time to kick things off. And there's a warm-up exercise there that I need everybody to get onto really quick. Just to warn you, this is going to be basically mostly me talking, but with punctuated moments of exercises to try and give people the visceral experience of the points that I'm making. So once you're onto the Miro board, there's a orange red circle that says start here. There's a green diamond there. And I want everybody to put into that green diamond what animal represents you best. That could be your spirit animal, your favorite animal, just an animal that represents you in some way or another. Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Hulter. I am an active duty Air Force technical sergeant and founder of the organization called Agitare. Agitare is a community of practice for facilitators of design and discovery frameworks within the defense and national security community. Incubated and supported by the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, we promote and support the employment of practices like design thinking, human-centered design, warfighter-centered design, think wrong, and other frameworks that involve guiding teams and organizations through complexity. At the heart of all of those practices that we're promoting are some common principles rooted in how to navigate uncertainty and complexity. And those guide how games of discovery are designed and executed. Games could be just these individual experiences and workshops that we do. If you've ever been in a design thinking workshop, they create these moments in time where you're exploring things together. You're navigating complexity with a facilitator. Today, I want to introduce you to some of the principles that underpin those games and hopefully convince you of the necessity for adopting better social technology in your organization. I hope if you decide to try and apply these methods, you'll join the Agitare community for support, education, and to share lessons learned along the way with a community, a rapidly growing community of other budding practitioners. So the warm-up, it looks like we have about 16 people on the Miro board. If you are not already there, I'm going to bring everybody to my view one more time. Sorry to do this. But if you haven't already done it, go ahead and put in this green diamond, what animal represents you best? Zebra bear. All right. And the second portion of this exercise, I'm going to ask you to do now. I'm going to ask you as a group to now, in the boxes below, categorize your animals. And I have to step away because my coffee's empty. So please, while I'm away I'll be gone for maybe a minute, making myself an espresso. But while I'm gone, please categorize your animals. I'll be right back. You all did very well, considering what I gave you to work with here. That there's a point to that exercise, and that is actually how poorly we tend to do. How well do we self-organize? When there aren't any guiding constraints, we self-organize badly. For example, if I give this diverse group, which we know it's a diverse group because of the variety of animals that people selected. One of the reasons I like this as a warm-up, this warm-up was invented by Chris, who's on the call as a co-host on this workshop right now, was just have people say what animal they are. I like it as a warm-up because everybody picks different animals for different reasons, right? It's a way of self-categorizing. It's a way of self-reflecting and being like, this is my animal. And because the way that I identify with that animal might be completely different from the way that other people, think of themselves in terms of which animal they'd pick. But I like it as a warm-up to workshops because it immediately paints a picture of the diversity in the room, which if you just were lucky enough to watch Franz Johansson's keynote, we can understand the importance of diversity. But another example, if I give this diverse group of people a list of tasks or projects, if I tell you to categorize and disseminate those tasks or projects out to different teams, give them autonomy to prioritize and take care of them, we can be sure there are going to be problems, because categorize these things means completely different things to different people. People have different perspectives and different priorities informed by our backgrounds, the way we were socialized, our neurological makeup. There's a whole lot of nurture and nature going on that makes us each a unique little animal. And thus, we all categorize in different ways. We categorize and process information in different ways. Examples: one person thinks dogs and cats belong in the pets category. Another person thinks pigs also belong in the pets category. Someone else thinks dogs and horses belong in the food category. Nobody here is correct about these categories. They're just perspectives. But these perspectives can really get in the way of how we self-organize, as we just demonstrated. But when we know who and what we're working with, why we're self-organizing, and we know the desired outcome, when we use the right balance of common values and constraints, actually we self-organize really well. And when we purposefully leverage our diversity to gain broader and deeper insights about the topic at hand, our diversity is no longer a weakness because it causes communication issues, but a strength. But let's be clear about one thing. When we're not aligned to a common sense of value and meaning, autonomy is damaging. Without the constraints of alignment, self-organization creates chaos. But let's look at what happens when we explore the whole problem space together as different people, and what happens to our ability to self-organize. And we're going to try this again with our animals. I'm going to ask my co-facilitators to help me out, but you can help out as well. I am revealing the first frame here. We're going to line our animals up vertically in that orange bar. All right. Now, to the right of each of these animals, I want you to just start listing attributes. The animals are listed vertically down the yellow bar. And just start listing attributes, just ways of describing them. And we're going to spend just a couple of minutes coming up with observations about these animals. That is a very large sticky note. Our goal here is just to come up with as many attributes of these animals as possible in the next couple of minutes. If for some reason you're not able to get to the Miro board, I changed the view in my screen so that you can see some of the stuff going on behind me on the Miro board. It seems like the unicorn is breaking the rules over there. That's kind of in keeping with unicorns, though. Just to repeat the instructions again. The animals go in the yellow bar. And to the right, we're listing attributes of those animals. All right, I'm going to call a pause on this. And I just want to point out something that happened as we worked on this. When one person shares an aspect, it inspires other people to ideate. One person, for example, I said, pandas have black and white fur, and it kind of aligned everybody to the idea of what the exercise was, right? It sparks this chain reaction of other ideas for how and what to describe. If one person says a color of fur, it might bring to mind other aspects of fur, the texture or the sheen, how it responds to water. And before you know it, using our collective brain, we've got more attributes than any one of us would be able to generate on our own, or all of us would be able to generate separately in so short a period of time. What I want to point out here is how the right social technologies don't just increase the performance of the group, they increase the performance of every member of the group. So group performance becomes exponentially better with the right social technology. This is the definition of synergy. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. That only happens when you're using the right social technology. I should note here that when brainstorming, generating together is not always the right answer. Some research has shown that people can sometimes be more creative separately. We all are cognitively different, which is why when facilitating for maximum divergence or creativity, it's best to include a little bit of silent generation on our own, or maybe generate ideas before the session and then bring them in and then do some ideation together. I like to refer to the book Scale by Jeffrey West in a lot of my writing. That book's all about the exponential superlinear dynamics of organisms, cities, and corporations and their growth, evolution, and life cycles. And in that book, he talks about how as the population density of cities goes up, the number of patent applications increases exponentially. They become exponentially more innovative with increased density. And that's the outcome of more people being more tightly packed together in cities, more serendipitous collisions. This is also largely what Franz Johansson's book, The Medici Effect, is all about. The power of intersections, power of collisions. This is where innovation happens. So in facilitation, one effect we're trying to create is serendipitous collision. And to be honest, we're often fighting against forces that want to prevent any kind of randomness, serendipitous or otherwise. This is also a concern I have for organizations that have an anti-meeting culture. If all of your collisions are purposeful, if you're only in conversations that feel relevant to you, you're programming out serendipity. You're fighting the effects we need for innovation. So let's consider the dynamics we created during this little game for a moment and what it shows us about what we need to facilitate in order to create even the simplest examples of discovery and sense making. We worked out loud by just putting our thoughts on a board where everybody could see them, right? That's called working out loud. As you can do in any number of ways, which enables us to create chains of ideas. As we hear and see the ideas that others are having and sharing, it inspires us to have ideas as well. We're no longer a bunch of separate brains. Together, we create a larger brain. We created psychological safety, a non-competitive communication environment. We're just adding information to the board, and none of the information competes with any of the other information because we already established that we're just putting ideas out there. We're, to speak in design thinking terms, we're in a divergent phase. One person adding information didn't cause another person's inputs to age off or lose status, which our old social technologies do pretty intensely. We all generated and shared at the same time, working in parallel without turn taking. It's one of the benefits of using sticky notes and whiteboards, allowing us to see ideas as they were being created, even as they were being formed. That allows us to build off of others' ideas, to interact with ideas in ways that circumvent the normal social dynamics. We interact with the ideas themselves, not with the people having the ideas, which means that social dynamics don't get in the way. The third thing was the goal was to create shared consciousness. In this case, on a virtual whiteboard, all ideas remained visible so we could continue to build off of them. By playing a game like this, we created a separate space where all of the information could be put into play. That's where our collective brain exists. And we're all lending our brain power to make that collective brain more capable. And there is an enormous amount of power just in that, just in what we've done so far. If I'm talking to you in a normal conversation, some of the information is in my head, some of the information is in your head, and we're usually trying to alter the information in each other's heads. There's competition there, so we protect ourselves. We guard our information against vulnerability, so we don't share every aspect of it. It's tied up in our identity and our status, and that causes us to hesitate, to reduce transparency, to attack others' positions, even though every position contains some amount of merit and some amount of relevance. It might be wrong, but if it might influence action, it is relevant and it should be taken into account. But if we do something as simple as creating a space that's outside both our heads and build on it together, one thing I like about it is that we're all facing the same direction. We're not competing, right? If we focus on building shared consciousness through working out loud, transparency, psychological safety, reducing competition, and we co-create that shared consciousness together, much more powerful things are possible. If we adopt the right social technology and set cultural conditions correctly, both in individual experiences, in workshops, and in our organizations generally, we can actually leverage the full power of what exists inside our heads and create even greater realities than the sum of our separate ones. So consider for a moment how many of our current social technologies fail to accommodate any of these conditions. We hold meetings in which all participants take turns, in which participation is also a type of performance in competition with other participants, which increases the level of interpersonal risk. Another example, we still rely heavily on email, which is effectively a long, narrow information pipe and highly competitive. The newest information has far too much weight compared to earlier information. It has our signature block on it. So all the information presented is tied up in our identity and our status in the organization. And as new information arrives, it makes the chain of context longer, not wider. People have to dive down into a chain of emails. I'd much rather put everybody together on a Miro board with some clever constraints and let information breathe on its own with some distance between it and the person who generated it. Get their identity out of the way. Create wider chains of context, not deeper. These exercises we just worked on are just to make a point about how we deal with simple information sets. We've already established the importance and power of the right social technology, and things only get more urgent from here. So now we have all these attributes. If we're looking to self-organize, one important thing we should be able to do now is come up with categories to try and make sense of all this information. I asked you to categorize initially and it didn't go well, right? But just by spending a little bit of time exploring ways of describing things, we're now far more well equipped to identify categories and sort information out in a way that we can all agree makes sense. This is why in sense-making workshops, we usually just start after establishing psychological safety and a sense of shared purpose. We usually just start with a simple observation, like we did with the animals. But figuring out what all those details mean can be tricky, and categorization is an important next step. It's the simplest way to start making sense of a bunch of disparate information. So if we're out to figure out ways of categorizing all these animals, we could start just by sorting these characteristics that we came up with into categories. And I'll start just by, grabbing one of these. I'm going to put it over here. Grab nocturnal. And I'm going to ask if somebody has something similar to nocturnal that might fit into the same category. And we can call this category, I don't know, sleep pattern. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just bring loves a nap. All right, so let's call it sleep habits. I'm going to ask you to bring them over and start building categories based on the information that has already been generated. And we're going to spend just 2 minutes building categories based on the details that we created. And the way this works is just start dragging individual items over one by one. And what category you think that fits into, go ahead and put a category over it. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes just exploring this information that we've generated here and how well we're able to categorize it together. I really appreciate all of these magical characteristics. If anybody else put magical characteristics on other animals, I'd be curious to hear what they are. I'm suspecting all of those are for the unicorn, although can fly is arguably a magical characteristic of birds. All right. And I'm going to call a pause on this. This exercise is called Affinity Mapping, and it's basically where you've taken all of the information gathered so far from your primary research, and our primary research was just we're describing animals, right? And then you sort it into categories. So that's a very simple way of coming up with a limited number of categories. And we could, at this point, pick categories that would evenly distribute our animals if that's what we needed to do. If we wanted to make it really easy, we could look at how other people have categorized animals through simple secondary research. Scientists have done a lot of the work for us already, separating them out into species, genus, family. Common categories are mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, fish, and insects, bipeds, quadrupeds, winged, legless, finned, etc. So those are, in the design workshop world, primary and secondary research, looking at aspects of what we're organizing and how those aspects form into patterns across the range of users, stakeholders, and perspectives. I just want to add here, I forgot to mention that I created this notes space below. I'm not very good at this workshop thing. And in the notes space, you can feel free to add any sticky notes for stuff that you want to remember later, so you don't have to keep notes on a different app or whatever, because things are going to get a little bit more cerebral here in a moment. So many design frameworks begin with simple observation and interviews. That's primary research. Are you designing something for someone? How much have you interacted with them? Do you know what matters most to them? These are crucial steps in any sense-making workshop. You just start with what exists, what is, what are we talking about here, who's involved? And these activities, primary and secondary research, can assist greatly with self-organization. And just these two activities that we just did, observing together and then sorting information into buckets, can be incredibly powerful. If you don't have enough details to generate a complete picture, start with interviews and use the data collected from that to drive sense making. This is a set of activities we can apply to any problem set and quickly come up with a clear idea of who's involved, what their differences are, what their similarities are, and build some kind of map of the problem context. And if we use the right social technology, we can do so in a way that generates buy-in, that circumvents bias, that broadens the scope to ensure we're including all potentially relevant information and enables us to co-create with those affected. Examples of canvases that accomplish these exact steps for various purposes include a stakeholder map, just to catalog who's involved, a user journey, just to describe the experience that someone goes through, a persona, to catalog and sort information about the experience and motivations of the most important players. And deciding which of these is necessary and useful requires something a little bit more. I'm going to uncover the next frame here. And then I'm going to lock it so people don't break it. What happens when we know the reason that we're gathering and categorizing information? Ultimately, before we start doing anything or solving a problem, we should, as Simon Sinek says, start with why. When we know why, that's when we really supercharge our ability to self-organize and make sense of things together. As I said earlier, self-organization without alignment is destructive. When we have alignment to a reason why, that's when self-organization takes its most creative, generative form. That's what mission command does. Establish commander's intent and then push autonomy to the lowest levels. That's what a team of teams does. Keeping with our example of animals, let's say the whole reason for this exercise is to create an animal shelter, to keep rescued animals safe and comfortable. Is it useful to categorize the animals by how many legs they have, by their color, by their fur type? How about by what they eat? Possibly. But if the point is to contain them together under the same roof, we can't just sort animals into two-dimensional types like they were different shapes and colors of rocks. Those are demographic attributes, those surface level characteristics. We have to recognize animals as thinking, behaving, feeling creatures with drives and motivations. When we start to ask why, it becomes rapidly more apparent what types of categories of attributes matter. And in a scenario like this, demographics don't really cut it. How about temperament? That's an attribute that matters significantly, because when you're deciding which animals go in a room together in your home animal shelter, you need to know if they're going to attack each other. We might want to look at all these animals on a spectrum of characteristics, like territoriality, I put here. And I put the furthest reaches as libertarian and communist. Sociability, from COVID-19 to 90s rave. These are psychographic attributes. We covered demographics. Those are surface level. Those are the most obvious things that we can observe about the environment or the people around us. With simple systems, where the agents of the system lack drives, motivations, and behaviors, we can categorize by two-dimensional attributes like this. But when you're talking about systems involving agents with agency, we can't just come up with a list of details, categorize them, and sort. Psychographic attributes are important when it comes to understanding how to design around behavioral response to certain conditions. In the example of animals, we might look at it with relation to other animals and food. When certain animals feel threatened or unsafe, they won't eat their food. That some animals might attack other animals just for getting close to their food. Some animals, like squirrels, might see food and hide it from other animals to make sure nobody else gets it. One nice thing about sorting information in the qualitative realm is that categories don't have to be a yes or a no or an absolute value. They're often about relative values or thresholds or potentiation, and they're susceptible to nudges, either intentional or inadvertent. If I'm talking about aggression in an animal, I'm not talking about a fixed value. It wouldn't make sense to sort dog breeds by aggressiveness, although people like to do that. How aggressive a dog is isn't a fixed value. It's highly variable and context dependent. I once knew a dog who would attack anybody wearing black or white shoes. What was that dog's aggressiveness level? I made a little chart here. To a person wearing red shoes, that dog was a sweet and friendly puppy. To a person who walked in without being warned with black and white indoor soccer shoes, like I had on one day, this dog was a vicious killer. I had known him as a friendly, sweet puppy, and suddenly, like that, he leapt into a new category, which speaks to the difficulty with categorization in the psychographic domain. This is the realm of personas, which are well-researched and developed hypotheses about the motivations of the people, or in this case, animals that we're designing for. Psychographic categorization is more like putting things on a spectrum or scenario planning. Values are largely relativistic rather than absolute. And we can create any number of categories based on the number of animals that we have. If we're here to put animals in an animal shelter, for example, let me go up to this. If we have 4 rooms, it doesn't make sense to say, let's find a way to distribute these animals evenly across these 4 rooms. Even distribution is something we might be tempted to ask for because we love to assume the need for constraints that actually have no purpose. But if task number 1 is to simply have these animals exist safely in this space, and we have 3 animals here who are highly territorial and 30 who are docile and friendly, then chances are the ideal solution would have us put the 3 territorial ones in 3 separate rooms and the remaining 30 in the final room. I want to foot stomp the fact that letting go of unnecessary constraints isn't just obvious like it is in this example. This is one reason why using design and discovery methods is so powerful, because one of the things we're providing using these methods is a safe environment to unpack and question our limiting beliefs. There's this concept in sociology called reification, which has been argued to mean a number of things by Karl Marx, George Simmel, and Max Weber, but can generally be described as the process in which human-made social systems turn humans into their powerless operators. It is the process through which we become convinced over time that human-made systems are the product of objective truths and thus can't be questioned. And I'll give you a couple examples. We tend to micromanage people in a Taylorist fashion, even though in knowledge work, well-guided autonomy produces better results.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah.
You mind putting that quote into your Miro board? I love what you just said.
I'll be happy to share what my content after the thing. Yeah.
That was pretty powerful.
So some smart guys in the industrial era created rules and principles of management that we now feel powerless to question and overcome. They might as well be natural laws because we perceive them as such. Another example, we engage in regular, even weekly time-wasting meetings using the same format and the old social technology, even though it actually fails to create transparency and reduces productivity. Another example, we put mission over people, even though that hurts people, and their lack of trust, autonomy, motivation, and their subsequent departure hurts the mission. One of our most damaging self-limiting beliefs is the idea that people can't be trusted. The most human-centered workplaces in the world have discovered that people will give you far more if you allow and enable them to care and give them room and autonomy to execute. And I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to express here what you think are some unnecessary self-limiting beliefs that we have in the defense community. I'm loving what you're all coming in with for this. I wish we could hang on this exercise for longer because you're getting very generative, and it's really powerful to see everybody coming up with these insights. But we're short on time. So there are countless unnecessary constraints that have formed deep grooves in the pathways of our organizations and culture that require deliberate effort to get our wheels out of. And most innovation involves letting go of the constraining beliefs that limit us. And understanding which of our beliefs are holding us back requires some amount of serious and regular self-reflection. This is why one of the first practices that I recommend that any organization start with is retrospectives. Do it weekly at a team level. Keep examining your experience, asking what could be better, whether you're meeting your intent, whether you're producing the desired value. This is why it's so important to regularly practice asking bold questions like we've seen the boldest organizations do in the wake of COVID-19. What if we didn't go back to the office? What if we went fully remote, like Platform One and a few other organizations have done? That is letting go of unnecessary constraints. And I'm going to take us back to our animals. Task number 1 here is to ask the right question. What actually matters most to us? Start with why. So one scenario that I brought up earlier might be, how might we keep these animals safe and comfortable and cared for in our shelter? In this case, the why is fairly close to the surface because we care about animals and we want them to be safe. In order to design for that, we would self-organize and perform discovery around animal-centered values. right? We consider the psychographic attributes that might make them safer or less safe in different configurations. We would develop a hypothesis and we would test it with prototypes. But we're going to pivot to another scenario that I think depicts the complexity of the problems we're usually faced with. I'm going to say that what we're designing for now is an animal storage facility where animals are held before being slaughtered and processed for meat. I apologize to any vegetarians out there. I understand this is kind of an upsetting example, but there's a reason that we're pivoting to this that you'll understand shortly. If what we're designing is an animal storage facility for animals who are held before being slaughtered and processed for meat, what do we design for then? What values drive us? What matters most? Some people, many people, might be tempted to say that what matters most here is meat quality and quantity and the efficiency of our processes to lower overhead costs. We're now talking about profit, right? Some might say that's justification enough to disregard the animal's experience because it's not a priority, but that would be short-sighted because the why isn't actually captured yet. How do we find why? We're going to do 2 exercises which are going to help us here. And the first one helps us figure out whose why, because there are a number of players involved. And the first order of business is to figure out which of them matter most. So to start with, we're just going to ask who's involved. And we'll do that with some stakeholder mapping. So please just take the next minute or so to add players to this map to describe who's involved in our animal storage operation. Go ahead and just start putting stickies on the board. Don't worry about whether you are correct. The nature of these exercises is always nebulous. We figure out the quality of ideas once we have a good quantity of ideas. So we're going to spend 1 minute just coming up with who's involved. All right, fantastic. Okay, usually it's not just obvious who the most important person on a stakeholder map is, but I'm going to point to this person right here, the consumer, as the one who makes the ultimate call about whether we are succeeding in our work or not. So normally in design exercises, you'd spend significantly more time figuring out who matters most, right? But for our purposes, I'm just going to cheat and say the consumer is who we're going to focus on right now. That is where value is actually created. If the consumer doesn't end up purchasing the product we're in service of creating, we fail. We won't succeed as a business. And we are well upstream of that event. So with that in mind, somebody's moving the frame here. Let me lock it again. I thought I locked it. With that in mind, I want to introduce you to something called the ladder of abstraction. This is a framing instrument that I learned from facilitator Daniel Stillman, author of the book Good Talk, which is all about conversation design. The ladder of abstraction is a bit of a weird tool because there are basically an infinite number of right answers, but potentially helpful for our purposes. The rules of the ladder are very simple, but it can require a bit of a mind stretch. To move up the ladder, we ask why questions. To move down the ladder, we ask how or in what way. As we move up the ladder, things get more abstract. At the top would be our primary why statement, and moving down the ladder, things get more concrete. At the bottom should be our primary how statement. So here's an example for you. Right here, I created this ladder of abstraction. I leapt at this opportunity to host this workshop. Before I decided how I was going to run it, I had to first ask myself why I wanted to do so. And here's a ladder of abstraction to describe my reason why. I knew I wanted to host a workshop on behalf of Agitare. and kind of reveal these methods to people and the underpinning, the dynamics you wanted to create. And why did I want to do that? It was to share the power and importance of facilitated discovery and design methods. So why did that matter to me? Why would I want to do that? Because I believe they can transform how people experience work, how effective and innovative they are. I want to help them want to learn how to do that. Why does that matter to me? Why do I want to do that? For me personally, it's because I have experienced the frustration and despair that comes from enduring long-standing problems and the relief, joy, motivation, resilience, and renewing energy that comes from empowerment, inclusion, autonomy, mastery, purpose. That's my why. Because I spent over a decade being treated like a cog in a massive machine at a heavy cost to both me and my family. And becoming actualized and enabled by human-centered methods and human-focused leaders was a revelation. This is why people in the design world can sometimes sound a bit like they've joined a cult, because they've tapped into something that brings meaning, that lights their spark, that they now bring energy to, where before they were just part of a system that disregarded their experience and humanity and took energy from them. At the heart of every problem, there is a human having an experience. Human experience is this nucleus. That's where the energy lies. Learn to tap into it, and you can move a civilization. And it can become regenerating when you start tapping into intrinsic motivation. So with abstraction laddering, I can also move down the ladder at every step by asking how and how else and how else. And that can help us understand how we want to tackle problems and what levers we want to pull in order to solve them. I knew that I wanted to help people, so I created another lane. This is for me. I knew I wanted to help people. How, in what specific way did I want to help people? I wanted to help others avoid and escape this thing that I've experienced before. And I can continue to move down the abstraction ladder from there. It's just to demonstrate kind of the usefulness of this tool. It can be used in any number of ways, and it can be flexed in any number of ways. Agitare has a common why, which is our mission statement. We exist to promote and support the employment of facilitated discovery methods and design methods across the national security community. We currently do that through a number of initiatives. Those are our how that we've come to through, and we're constantly iterating on it. We have a podcast, we have introductory courses, we maintain a community forum, a very active community forum on Slack. We have catalogs of resources, partnerships with other organizations, and hosted events, an active sharing campaign on LinkedIn, this workshop. These are all how. But we're always asking ourselves whether those are meeting our why. And we're always asking ourselves, how else might we create the intended value? We regularly climb up and down the ladder of abstraction to check in. We use the OKR framework and regular reflective practice to do so. Some of the most powerful things you can do with active, regular reflective practice and constant facilitated discovery are to rediscover your why and constantly check in with your how and keep asking, how else? So I've placed a single ladder here for the animal scenario. Whoops. I promise I placed a single ladder here. Okay. With this prompt, we're storing animals in this facility and they will later be slaughtered and processed for meat. On the rung above that, I want you to come up with reasons why. Ask yourself, why, as the storage facility, why are we doing this? For what purpose? And then ask yourself, why else? And keep adding to it, because there could be an infinite number of reasons why through different framing. So I'm just curious to see what you come up with. And I want you to think about that stakeholder map and the person who we decided matters most, which is the customer. Why are we doing this with them in mind? All right, I'm moving one over. Let's go ahead and pause the exercise now. A lot of you kind of got to this in other ways. This is one of the useful things about when you're adding all this stuff together. Sometimes you affinity map and find out what their common theme is, right? When you're trying to sense make in this way. So I pulled something over, which is so people can buy meat, right? That's our user and a need that they have, which is why I put it into a customer lane here. One of the whys here, why we're doing this, is so that people can buy meat. So let's move down the ladder from there. How might they accomplish this? Well, they might accomplish that by purchasing meat from a store, right? To get even more concrete than that, to get even more specific than that, how might they purchase meat from a store? They might purchase our meat, that's just more specific, from a store that we distribute to. This is one way that the ladder of abstraction can work. This is the abstract concept, purchasing meat from a store. The more specific version of that would be purchasing our meat from a specific store. And then we can also ask how else? How might they purchase meat from a store? They could also purchase a competitor's meat from a store, right? Either the same store that we distribute to or a store we don't distribute to. So it's important to not only ask why, but for each of those why questions, we should also ask how and how else. So let's go back up the ladder of abstraction here. They purchase meat in a store. Why would they do that? Like, why are they motivated from their perspective? Why are they motivated to purchase meat from a store? Well, perhaps it's to feed their family, right? How else might they do that? They could buy a frozen lasagna. That's another how else, right? Or they could purchase any other foods, starches or vegetables. Well, we've just identified by going up and down the ladder of abstraction, we've identified two critical behavioral touch points for the design of our animal house. They involve somebody making the decision to purchase meat at a supermarket and deciding to go with our brand over somebody else's. And this brings us to the fact that even as a piece of this value chain, well upstream of where value is actualized, we have to consider the perspective and the options of the consumer and the behavioral touch points that cause them to choose the things that would fulfill our value proposition over other people's. Why and how are we holding these animals? Well, that depends entirely on what matters most to the user, to the consumer. The psychographic attributes of those customers, it turns out, are incredibly important for us to understand and design for. Imagine a scenario in which consumers hear that we've been keeping our animals in cruel conditions because we scoped the problem out too shallowly to value efficiency, meat quality, and meat quantity. And now I've got a bunch of customers who would rather pay more from local farms that they know are treating their animals kindly. I have it on good authority that this is a concern for the meat industry because I'm one of those consumers. I am largely vegetarian, but will purchase meat that I'm sure came from cruelty-free conditions. There are restaurants near me that advertise their food as being sourced from local cruelty-free farms. And I go to those restaurants way more than I go to other restaurants because that value proposition appeals to me personally a great deal. So the psychographic attributes of customers, well downstream of our context, it bears significant weight for the way that we design our facility. Consider also the fact that the appetites and motivations of each of those involved agents and stakeholders are always evolving. What matters most now might not matter soon. I think the COVID-19 pandemic forced that lesson on a lot of people. So the reason I moved from the example of the animal shelter to the pre-slaughterhouse animal storage facility is because the end result for how you design those two things might be identical, to minimize the discomfort and to consider the well-being of the animals themselves, but for completely different reasons. And if we don't dig deep enough, we will fail to account for our tendency to design in a way that ignores or even harms the people who matter most. And many of the problems we face contain these inherent conflicts between the interests of those most visible and the interests of the people who matter most. For example, how focusing on our own profits might lead us to take actions that harm the animals in our care, which is, to some people's standards, morally dubious, ethically dubious. But also for our context, even if we don't consider the moral implications, will ultimately hurt our profits. I can't help but think of all the brilliant airmen that I've seen leave the Air Force because they had leaders who were mission focused at the expense of the human beings in their care. We have a serious mental health and suicide crisis across the services. Earlier this year, I wrote about how our core values seem to advocate the same thing: service before self, mission first, at the expense of all else. And adding people always doesn't appear to be doing the trick. What if we put people first? How might we do that? Our approach has to begin with a larger abstract why and move into the specific, down the ladder of abstraction, into the concrete, to the what and how, including the voices and the why, the reason why for the people who matter most. And how you go about doing that depends on what domain the problem you're solving exists in. When I first learned about human-centered design and design thinking, I found a lot of people presenting these methods as though designing an animal shelter. Not simple, but there's a system to follow. You figure out what matters most. You design for who's in the room. It's pretty straightforward. But most of the contexts we end up designing for actually meet the complexity of the animals for slaughter scenario. The temptation is to treat it just like a complicated system, but in reality, it's complex. And if we design for complexity as though it's merely complicated, we will fail catastrophically every time. All right, we're going to take one step deeper here. I want everybody really quick for me to just take a deep breath. And then breathe out. All right, and then I want everybody to turn your camera on, if you're comfortable turning your camera on. And I want you to make a really intense face for the thumbnail view for this recording. Just your most intense face. It doesn't have to be silly, just... Okay. That's a way of getting the blood flowing, without having to stand up. I'm a really lazy motivational speaker. Okay. I'm going to lock this frame. We're going one step deeper here, but we're coming close to time. I want to talk really quick about... I'm going to spotlight my view because I'm sharing some concepts. This is the Cynefin framework. It was invented by Dave Snowden, famously grumpy Welshman. And it's a sort of a map to help leaders understand the decision-making process in different domains and contexts. So really briefly, Cynefin helps us understand the difference between ordered systems on the right side of this framework, in which cause and effect is knowable in advance, and unordered systems on the left. The chaotic, in which there's no discernible relationship between cause and effect, and the complex, in which there are so many agents interacting in so many ways that the chain of causation is only knowable in retrospect. And even then, we tend to oversimplify. A graphing calculator is an example of an obvious system or a clear system. It's ordered because cause and effect is knowable in advance, and decision-making in the context of a calculator just requires that I learn best practices, which I can do just by reading a manual or a book or taking a class. I can then sense to find out what category of problem I'm dealing with. And then based on that category, I use best practices. Here, sorry, some things are left unlocked. I know people like to move things if they're unlocked. All right. Okay, so that's the realm of best practice. Motorcycles are ordered systems. They probably fit within the complicated domain because it takes a degree of expertise to diagnose systemic ailments. It requires a few years of experience probably to know how to diagnose and solve problems in a motorcycle. We know it's an ordered system because they can be taken apart and put right back together by someone with specialized expertise. And decision making in the context of a motorcycle, if there's like a problem and you need to figure out what to do inside the guts of a motorcycle, is about diagnosis, it's about analysis of a problem and response based on best practice or good practice. You could theoretically boil the diagnosis and repair of a problem in the complicated guts of a motorcycle down to a playbook or a walkthrough, but expertise is advisable. That's how you know it's in the complicated domain. If we were going to engage in the discovery practice within the context of a motorcycle, it would be sufficient to draw up a comprehensive systems map with all the components. This is where systems thinking really thrives. With a little bit of demographic discovery and categorization of problem types, we should be okay. In the domains of the clear and complicated, reductionist approaches serve us well. If a motorcycle is a complicated system, then a good example of a complex system would be a motorcycle race. You can take apart and put a motorcycle back together. You can't do the same with a motorcycle race. When we add speed, unpredictability, and road conditions, weather, visibility, and fill the road with other agents with their own perceptions, motivations, and agency, now we're getting into complexity. A motorcycle may be a complicated system, but a motorcycle race is highly complex. And decision-making in the context of a motorcycle race can't be boiled down to a set of steps or best practices. It requires what Cynefin calls for in the navigation of complexity. You probe and then sense and respond. And it can only be accomplished by someone in contact with the complexity on the track, because the best course of action is only the best course of action for a particular moment in time, for a particular configuration of that system, after which the state of the system might need to be probed, sensed again, and then responded to accordingly. To probe, you interact with the system in some way in order to sense the current state of the system. So how motorcycle racers do this is by feeling the bike and the road underneath them. They sense with their bodies how to take a turn. They were how to respond to road conditions, to respond to other riders. There are social dynamics and psychological dynamics at play. There are processes happening that are entirely sensory and subconscious. How the bike feels beneath them, the wind resistance, how much they can lean into this turn, nearly in contact with the road and other riders. I really like something that John Margolick once said to me in a discussion about design thinking for the Disruptive AF podcast. He said that a basketball player always keeps their hand on the player they're guarding. They can feel when they're about to move. In a highly dynamic environment in which other agents within the system have their own agency, you have to feel when they're moving. You have to probe continuously to sense and then respond. You have to be capable of sensing when the state of the system changes so you can adjust your response. Another discipline in here is weak signal detection. So what does this have to do with games of discovery? Let me just say that a lot of people like to depict design and discovery, these methods, as ordered systems that can navigate complexity. The point that I want to make today is that the frameworks themselves, because they are prescriptive and ordered, are merely complicated. And complicated systems don't do well on their own in complexity. Design thinking is a motorcycle. Human-centered design is a motorcycle. Scrum, retrospectives, OKRs, and DevSecOps are motorcycles. All of these systems for navigating human complexity in our organizations can be operated either effectively or ineffectively. They can't simply be adopted. They can't be put on like an article of clothing, or installed like a piece of software, or consumed like a pill. It all comes down to the practitioners, the facilitators who wield them. The ability to feel the road and know how to respond to changing conditions, to navigate, to make decisions in the midst of that complexity. That's something the writer does. It's something they develop through experiential learning and deliberate practice. And that's why Agitare focuses primarily on the competencies of the facilitator, the one who operates these frameworks in complexity. You can't just purchase a racing bike and expect to start winning or even completing races. The true potential power of these instruments comes from how they are wielded, adapted, improvised with. by skilled facilitators and practitioners. And those facilitation skills aren't developed in a classroom. Just like martial arts skills aren't developed from a desk or by reading a book, just like becoming an effective leader happens as a result of being in contact with complex human scenarios. No ordered system will save us. This is not a job for PME. What we need is repeated immersion, deliberate practice to be uncomfortably and repeatedly in contact with ambiguity. And the practitioners of those practices have needs as well. They need a community, they need support, they need encouragement, opportunities to safely fail, a method to maximize learning from deliberate practice. Is my audio okay, Chris? Can you understand me?
Yeah, man. I'm just letting you drop the mic. Keep rolling, buddy.
All right. So the good news is that not all of our problems require expertise in multidisciplinary and long-term strategic military design like you get from the courses at the Joint Special Operations University, which I do highly recommend. Today, I shared with you a few pretty easy games just to demonstrate the power of a different type of social technology. And we could start just by getting out of our own way. Have better conversations, be more self-reflective more often using something like retrospectives, or by designing our conversations. We could increase psychological safety within our organization, create collaborative conditions, and stop fostering competition. The first step to becoming better at navigating complexity is to actually face it, step into it rather than letting it overtake you as you try to run. Also, don't just try to hire outside contractors to navigate it for you. I told a lot of my friends in the design and facilitation industry, I'm here to put you out of business because I think it's not good for us to expect that we can just bring in outsiders when it's time to navigate complexity. We are always immersed in complexity. This is not just an occasional workshop thing. This is, we need these competencies now, always, inside our teams. Agitare doesn't provide designer discovery workshops as a service. I'm not interested in enabling more organizations to feel like they don't have to get good at this stuff because they can just bring in outsiders. Agitare exists to support practitioners who want to gain those competencies for themselves, for their organizations. When solving problems, it probably makes sense to identify all the actors like we did with the animals, right? It makes sense to catalog and categorize surface level characteristics. All of that together in a map would probably suffice if the problem existed in the clear or complicated domain, which many of our problems do. So you can start just by adopting simple practices. Start doing very simple discovery and framing exercises for your obvious and complicated domain problems. But when it's complex, we need to probe that system to determine its present state, and then based on that state, come up with hypotheses for action. What if we invited the agents within the system to self-reflect? That's how we probe. That's how you probe, by including those humans in the process, by co-creating solutions with those who matter most. A good friend of ours in the Agitare community named Marcus Carrion, aka Cuss, who's with us today, shared a story recently in our Slack group about how design and discovery practices helped his family through a difficult event. His brother was in a terrible motorcycle accident and in the ICU. His condition was unclear. The pandemic wasn't taking a break, and his family was cast into the extreme turmoil of worry, fear, and uncertainty. So Cuss, having had a bit of an introduction to facilitated discovery practices through Agitare and our friend Toga's project Designing Space, he created a board on Miro, like this one we've been playing with. And he and his sister put everything on there, their feelings, fears, perceptions, hopes, potential end states. And they started to make sense of the chaos. They ended up building a pick chart with the most important action items to get after. They moved from uncertainty and chaos to a clear idea of who matters most and what to do next. And Cuz told me his brother is a high-performance Subaru mechanic and loves his job. With his injuries, he won't be able to make it to work for the foreseeable future. He said that during his family facilitation, he explained to his father and sister the importance of divergence of suspending judgment and voicing wild ideas. And in the midst of all that pain and fear and uncertainty, he described to me how his dad made a joking remark about parking a car in his brother's room so he could work on it while he was laid up. And that spiraled off into this joyful chain reaction of other ideas about how to best lift his brother's spirits and bring him the things that matter most to him. He said in that moment he saw a level of safety created as together they played a simple game of discovery. It sounds simple and small, but I can tell you it is not. I haven't touched on the last domain of Cynefin yet in detail. That's the chaotic domain, where there is no relationship between cause and effect. There's just too much going on. Patterns don't exist in such a way that they can be latched onto. In the chaotic domain, you don't probe first. You don't sense before responding. You just take action. Because sensing wouldn't result in any, it doesn't make sense. There's not patterns you can take advantage of. I only recently wrapped my head around one version of navigating the chaotic domain in the real world after taking the Joint Special Operations University's Design Fundamentals course, where we did a lot of drawing for reflection on complex systems. And what I realized by drawing system after system with no guidance, but somehow still producing insights every time, was that creating a visual representation is a way of taking action in the chaotic domain. And the chaos we most often face is experienced internally in the form of confusion or feeling overwhelmed, of not knowing where to start. And by taking action, by externalizing our feelings, observations, and experience, by putting it on a flat surface in the form of a drawing, a collage of pictures, a model out of Legos, or a pile of sticky notes, we move from a state of navigating internal chaos alone to navigating coherent, sortable information in a shared space. And that's what Cuss's story reminded me of. In the face of their shared and also separate internal chaos, they started to orient themselves by taking action with a simple game of discovery. They ended up playing a game of yes and, which resulted in them ultimately purchasing a model car for his brother to build as he recovers from his extensive injuries. So if you find yourself lost, wrestling with your own internal chaos and the chaos of your organizational dynamics that keep you siloed and confused, I encourage you to just start playing simple games of discovery. Even the simplest, the ones that enhance our meetings by making us more reflective, increase psychological safety, create shared consciousness, start doing retrospectives, have better conversations. Even the simplest ones can have a massive impact on the individuals in your organization. And I'd like to encourage all of you as well to join Agitare in that journey. This is why we exist, to support others in their adoption and adaptation of better social technologies so that we can start building up those competencies within the defense community. You can find on the far right side of the board here a frame called How to Get Started with links to Agitare's website, our YouTube, LinkedIn, and a form to request access to our Slack group. Beneath that, I think I uncovered the frame. Beneath that are some books that have inspired me on this journey, which I drew inspiration from for my writing on innovation, facilitation, and for this workshop. I highly recommend all of them, and I'll be adding them to the main DEF2020 Miro board. And I'd like to invite all of you just in our final minutes. I think we have 7 minutes left. I threw together a quick liberating structures exercise. This is one of the frameworks that I'm a big fan of. Liberating structures is like an open source community of facilitators internationally. And this exercise, what I'm going to ask you to do is just your reflections on within the defense community and the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. Start with purpose. This frame here. Why is the work important to you and the larger community? And then kind of work your way in the spiral. This is another example of abstraction laddering. If you think about it, you start with a why, what is your purpose? And then you slowly spiral your way downward into the more concrete. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for joining me today and giving me the opportunity to share what Agitare is all about. And it is really incredible that I managed to finish this within time, because it was a little touch and go there for a minute. But please, I would love to see your reflections on the purpose to practice exercise. Otherwise, I'm willing to open up the floor as well to anybody who would like to just chat for the next 6 minutes.
Dan, I've got one little thing to toss in. That is that I think describing this as a human technology is really critical. It's not something, that terminology is not something that I've seen in a lot of the workplaces that I've been in. And I think it's something that unlocks people's thinking about this and understanding of it. And I just wanted to kind of tip my hat to the way that you framed that. My dog likes it too, so.
Well, your dog's opinion matters a great deal to me. Yeah, I really latched on to, I think I got it from Karen Petty-Hold. She uses the term social technology. And I really like that, because if you think about it, technology is intended to help you navigate some kind of complexity. It's supposed to mask it from you and make it accessible by putting something between you and the complexity that you're trying to deal with. A calculator does that, or an operating system does that, right? It's a type of, it gives you access to complexity. And when I heard Karen Petty-Hold use the term, I was like, yeah, that's exactly what meetings are. They're a social technology, and meetings are a social technology from the Stone Age. And it's like well past time we upgraded our social technology, because there are way better ways of getting inclusion and getting psychological safety. We do have a lot of collaboration going on with the Centers for Adaptive Warfighting. We have a public presence for Agitare, but because it's a community of practice, a lot of the churn that happens is inside of our Slack, so that people, it's a kind of a safe place for people to operate only with people who are bought into these methods. So we're not having to constantly explain ourselves to outsiders. This is one of the powerful things. I created Agitare because I needed it. This is kind of what my abstraction laddering is, right? This is what I needed. I realized it wasn't enough to just learn these methods. There's like a lot that I need in order to be capable of trying to bring them to the defense community, which is a challenging task, to say the least. And we have just about 3 minutes left, and I believe then we're headed over to is it State of the Union next?
No, we'll be back in the plenary, and if my memory serves me correctly, we are going into, I'm looking actually at the schedule, we're going to go into the X work project.
All right, excellent. Another thing that I really like about what we're doing with Agitare is we're not trying to figure out how to plug a framework in to the defense community. We're trying to figure out what works about these in the commercial sector and adapt it for our context, which I think is a really important element. All of these successful implementations I've seen in organizations in the commercial and the defense sector involved a significant adaptation. What works for your organization? So we're borrowing and stealing from a number of different frameworks to make it function within our various contexts. I like going into some of the facilitated sessions that some of our members are doing, and I'm like, that exercise is from Think Wrong. That exercise is from design thinking. Oh, there's a systems thinking exercise. We got some Lean Six Sigma. We've got liberating structures. Seriously, we're pulling from like, you know, I don't know. At this point, I feel like we've got 15 different sources. The CAW, we do see a lot of warfighter-centered design as well.
Good job, Dan. I'm going to drop off, brother. You killed it, man.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting for all. This has been really a lot of fun. Thanks for spending your time with me.
Thanks again, Daniel.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
Awesome work.
Thank you.
See you back in the main room.
All right. Bye.